The moon was still burning. It had been burning for 3 hours, and nobody had come to put it out. There was no point. The Confederacy had lost this ground. Every ship that had been sitting in orbit above this rock was either gone or falling. The black sky above was full of floating metal and smoke, and the ground below was covered in ash, broken machines, and things that used to be soldiers. Commander Zyreth walked through all of it without stopping. She was Kalith. Her skin was silver and covered in small flat scales that caught the light of the fires around her. She was tall, even by Kalith's standards, and she moved the way all Kalith's soldiers moved, quietly, carefully, with her eyes always checking the next shadow before her feet moved toward it. She had been in 7 wars. She had walked through worse places than this. Not many, but a few. Behind her, 4 of her soldiers followed in a tight line. All of them Kalith. All of them quiet. Their armor was scratched and burned in places, but they were alive, and that was more than could be said for most of the people who had been on this moon 6 hours ago. They were doing a sweep, looking for survivors, looking for anything worth saving before command pulled them out, and this rock became a memory in a report that nobody would enjoy writing. So far, they had found nothing alive. Zyreth moved around the broken side of a large transport vessel. It had come down hard and split open like a cracked shell. The inside was dark and full of twisted metal. She signaled her unit to spread out along the wreckage and check both sides. They moved without speaking. They had done this enough times that words were not needed. She was about to move past the far end of the ship when she stopped. She heard something. Not the fire, not the wind, not the slow groan of cooling metal. A sound that did not belong to a dying place. She raised her hand. Her unit froze. She listened. There it was again. A short, rough sound, like something being dragged, or something moving on purpose. Zyreth stepped around the broken tail section of the transport, her weapon raised, her finger ready. What she saw made her stop completely. There was a human crouched on the ground. He was young. That was the first thing she noticed. Young in the way that made her think of soldiers who had just finished their training and were still surprised that war was real. His armor was torn open across the chest and left arm. There was blood on his face, dry and dark, and more blood on his hands. His helmet was gone. His hair was short and dark and matted down on one side. He was not hiding. He was not calling for help. He was crouched over 3 dead bodies, but they were not Confederate bodies. They were shroud drones, the pale, multi-limbed things that the hive mind sent forward first, the ones that tested a position before the real attack came. All 3 of them were dead. 1 had been cut, 2 had been shot at very close range. The ground around them was dark and wet. The human had killed all 3 of them, alone. He was breathing hard. His chest rose and fell fast, like a creature that had been running. But his hands were steady. His eyes were moving, checking left, checking right, checking the ridgeline in the distance. He was not panicking. He was not crying. He was watching, waiting for more to come. Zyreth kept her weapon up. She said, in Confederate Common, the language that all species in the Alliance were expected to know, "Human, identify yourself." He looked at her. His eyes were dark brown. He did not flinch when he saw 5 armed Kalith soldiers standing in front of him. He looked at them the way someone looks at a door opening, with attention, not fear. "Private Callum Dre," he said. His voice was calm, flat, like he was answering a question at the end of a long day. "3rd Embedded Unit, Human Integration Program. My unit is gone." He paused for 1 second. "Are there more shroud coming from the eastern ridge or not?" Zyreth stared at him. There was a sound beside her. It was Verith, the youngest soldier in her unit, leaning slightly toward the soldier next to him and whispering something low in Kalith. She did not have to hear it to know what he said. He said what anyone would say looking at a small, soft-skinned human covered in blood next to 3 dead shroud drones. He said the human must have gotten lucky. Ziraeth did not correct him, not yet. She answered the human's question. Yes, she said. Scouts have marked movement on the eastern ridge. Estimated contact in 9 minutes. The human, Callum, nodded once. He looked down at his weapon, checked something on the side of it with his thumb, and then looked back at the eastern ridge. He stood up slowly, like his body hurt, but he stood all the way up, and he stayed standing. Then he walked toward the eastern ridge. Not away from it, toward it. Ziraeth watched him take 4 steps in that direction before she spoke. Human. He stopped and looked back at her. You are injured. He looked down at his side as if he had forgotten about it. I know, he said simply. Then he looked at the ridge again. Ziraeth looked at her unit. Verath was staring at the human with an expression that had shifted from dismissal to something more complicated. The others were watching her, waiting for her call. She clicked twice on her comm, the Calyx signal for advance and follow, and walked after Callum Dre. Her unit followed. They held the ridge. It was not easy, and it was not clean, but they held it. And when the extraction ships finally came down 40 minutes later, Ziraeth's unit was alive, and the ridge was quiet. She watched Callum walk up the ramp of the extraction ship. He was limping by then, though she doubted he had been limping when it mattered. One of the ship's medics reached out to take his arm and help him. He led her, which surprised Ziraeth slightly. She had expected him to refuse, but he thanked the medic quietly and let himself be guided to a seat. Ziraeth sat across from him in the hold as the ship lifted off the burning moon. She looked at him once. He was leaning his head back against the wall with his eyes closed. He looked like a person who had been holding something very heavy for a long time and had only just been allowed to put it down. She opened her field report on her datapad. She filled in the standard entries. Unit status, casualties, asset recovery. Then she got to the section for personnel notes. She paused. She thought about what she had seen on the ground next to that broken ship. She thought about the 3 dead shroud drones and the young human crouching over them with steady hands, watching a ridge, waiting for more. She wrote 1 line under her official seal, in addition to the standard report. It said, 1 human survivor recovered. Combat effective. Do not reassign. Then she closed the pad and looked out at the burning moon getting smaller below them. She did not know his name yet. Not really. She did not know his history or his home or why he had come this far across the galaxy to fight in a war that was not originally his. She knew only what she had seen. And what she had seen was enough. The ship was called the Iron Veil, and it had never carried a human before. This was obvious in small ways. The bunk assigned to Callum Dre was slightly too short for him, so his feet hung off the end. The food dispensers did not have any settings that matched what humans were supposed to eat, so the ship's cook, a quiet Caliph named Orvin, had spent 2 days figuring out something that would not make him sick. The lighting in the human quarters ran a little too blue, because nobody had thought to check what kind of light humans preferred. Nobody had thought about any of it, really, because nobody had expected to have a human on board. But he was here, and the crew was watching. Not in a rude way, in the way that people watch something they do not fully understand, and are not sure how to ask about. They passed by his quarters a little slower than necessary. They found reasons to be in the same corridor when he walked to the mess hall. They listened when he spoke, even when he was not speaking to them. Ziraeth noticed all of this. She said nothing about it. She simply watched her crew watching him, and she found it more interesting than she expected. The first thing that genuinely alarmed the crew happened on the 3rd night. Caliph did not sleep the way humans slept. They entered a light rest state for about 2 hours, staying aware enough to respond to sounds or alarms. It was efficient. It was practical. It was simply how their bodies worked. So when the ship's medic, a careful and experienced woman named Fessy, checked on Callum at the 6th hour of the night cycle and found him completely, deeply, utterly unconscious, she did what any reasonable Caliph would do. She went straight to Ziraeth. "Commander," Fessy said, standing in the doorway with a medical scanner in her hand, and a look on her face like she was delivering bad news. "The human has been unresponsive for 6 hours. Ziraeth put down her report and looked up. "Is he breathing?" "Yes, steadily. His body readings are all normal, but he will not wake up." Fessy paused. "I tried speaking to him, loudly. He made a sound and turned over." Ziraeth followed her to the human quarters. She stood in the doorway and looked at Callum. He was lying on his too-short bunk, with one arm over his eyes and his mouth slightly open. He was making a low, regular rumbling sound from somewhere in his chest. "That sound," Ziraeth said quietly, "is that a symptom?" Fessy checked her scanner. "I believe it is just something his body does." They stood there for a moment in silence, two experienced soldiers watching a young human sleep, trying to decide if it was dangerous. He slept for 9 hours total. When he finally appeared in the mess hall the next morning, looking rested and calm and slightly confused by the way everyone immediately stopped what they were doing and looked at him, Ziraeth told him what had happened. He listened, and then he laughed. It was a short, genuine sound, and it surprised everyone in the room. "That's just sleeping," he said. "Humans need about 8 hours, every day." Fessy looked at him with serious eyes. "Every day," she repeated. "Every day." There was a long silence. Verath, sitting at the far end of the table, did the calculation quietly in his head, and then looked at Callum with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and fascination. "You are unconscious for a third of your life," he said. Callum considered this. "When you put it that way," he said, "it sounds worse than it is." The second thing that fascinated the crew was the eating. Caliph consumed nutrient compounds, small, dense, flavorless. They provided everything the body needed and took almost no time to finish. It was fuel, nothing more. The idea of food as an experience, as something prepared with care, smelled before tasting, eaten slowly and with apparent pleasure, was something the crew understood only in the way you understand a fact without truly feeling it. Orvin had eventually managed to put together something for Callum from the ship's stores. It was not anything from Earth, but it had texture and warmth and something close to flavor. When Callum sat down and ate it, the crew watched him the way they might watch an unusual creature at a nature exhibit. He ate slowly. He paused between bites. At one point he closed his eyes briefly, which Verath later reported to 2 other soldiers with an air of deep, personal bewilderment. "He closed his eyes," Verath said, "while sitting at a table on a warship. Nobody had a good explanation for this. But it was the sparring that changed things." Vec had been the quietest and most skeptical member of the crew since Callum came aboard. He was a large Caliph, older than most of the unit, with a long service record, and the kind of confidence that came from being very good at difficult things for a very long time. He had not said anything openly disrespectful about the human. He had simply done something worse. He had been politely unimpressed, in the loud, obvious way that politely unimpressed people always manage to be. On the 5th day, Vec suggested a sparring match. He did not suggest it cruelly. He suggested it the way a veteran suggests anything to someone younger, with a kind of casual certainty that the outcome was already known, and the whole exercise was just a formality. Some of the crew gathered to watch. Ziraeth stood at the edge of the room with her arms folded. The first exchange lasted 4 seconds. Vec was faster and stronger, and Callum hit the mat hard. He got up. The second exchange lasted 6 seconds. Vec used the same move, slightly adjusted. Callum hit the mat again. He got up again. By the third exchange, Callum was not fighting the same way he had at the start. He was lower. His footwork had changed. He was not trying to match Vec's strength. He was moving around it, testing the edges of it, like someone walking around a large rock to find the other side. The fourth exchange lasted almost a full minute. Vec did not put him on the mat that time. When it ended, both of them were breathing hard, and the room was very quiet. Vec looked at Callum for a long moment. He did not say anything. He nodded, once, slowly. In Caliph, that nod meant something specific. It meant, I see you now. That evening, Zyra F found Callum sitting alone near the observation window at the back of the ship. The stars outside were still and cold. He was looking at them with the kind of quiet that belonged to someone thinking about something far away. She sat across from him. She asked him the question she had been holding since the moon. She asked him why he had walked toward the ridge when the smart thing, the safe thing, the rational thing would have been to wait. He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, just finding the right words. Because if I waited, he said, you would have hit that ridge without knowing what was on it. He looked at her, and then I would have had to watch that happen. Zyra F said nothing for a while. She looked at him sitting there, young and tired and very far from home. And she thought about what he had just said. He had run a calculation. He had looked at a group of strangers from a species that was not his own, on a moon that was not his world, in a war that his people had only recently joined, and he had decided that their lives were worth walking into danger for. Not out of orders, not out of glory, out of something quieter and older than both. She did not have a word for it in Caliph. She looked it up later in the Confederate Common Lexicon. The word was decent. She closed the lexicon and sat with that for a long time. Nobody had expected the shroud to move this fast. That was the honest truth, and it sat in every briefing room and every command channel like something heavy that nobody wanted to pick up. 6 systems in 4 days. Coordinated strikes across the whole Yessen corridor, which was a long stretch of space that connected the outer rim to the Confederate core worlds. If the corridor fell, the war stopped being something that happened at the edges. It became something that happened everywhere. Zyra X's unit was sent in with 6 other ships and orders that changed 3 times before they even arrived. There was no clean front line in the Yessen corridor. There was only noise and fire and the shroud coming from directions that did not make sense until they already had you surrounded. The pale drones hit fast and in groups, and behind them came the larger ones, heavy and slow and very hard to kill, that the Confederate soldiers had started calling walls, because that was what fighting them felt like. Callum fought beside the unit. He was still technically listed as unassigned. His transfer order was still sitting in Zyreth's files, untouched. She had not filed it and had not spoken about it, and nobody on the crew had asked. There were more important things happening. There were always more important things happening, and Zyreth had decided, without saying it out loud, that she intended to keep it that way. On the second day of fighting in the corridor, during a breach engagement inside a damaged Confederate relay station, a shroud-heavy drone came through a wall that everyone had believed was solid. It caught Callum across the chest and left side with one of its long, hard limbs, the kind of strike that was meant to knock a soldier down and keep them down. Callum stumbled. He hit the side of a console. He pushed himself off it and kept moving. He fought for the next 40 minutes. He covered the left flank when Verath's position got cut off. He pulled a wounded Caliph soldier back from an open doorway where the firing was coming from. He coordinated with Vec across a smoke-filled corridor, using nothing but hand signals, and kept their line from breaking at the worst moment. When the relay station was finally clear and the shooting stopped, Callum sat down against a wall and did not get up. Fessy reached him first. She ran her medical scanner over him quickly, the way she always did after a fight. checking for the things that soldiers didn't always notice about themselves in the middle of combat. She was professional and calm, right up until the scanner beeped and showed her the results. She lowered the scanner slowly. Her expression changed. Xyrath was across the room. She saw Thessie's face and walked over. "What is it?" Thessie held up the scanner so Xyrath could see the display. She kept her voice low and even, the way people keep their voices when they are trying not to alarm someone. 2 broken ribs, laceration along the left side, significant internal bruising. She paused. "He has been fighting with this for 40 minutes. Xyrath looked at Callum. He was leaning his head back against the wall with his eyes half closed. He looked tired. He did not look like a person who had been walking around with 2 broken ribs. "Why did he not report it?" Xyrath said. It was not really a question. Thessie said quietly, "I think he may not have fully felt it, not while the fighting was happening. The human body, under enough stress, produces something that blocks pain signals, not permanently, but long enough." She set the scanner down. "I have read about this in Confederate medical texts. I did not truly believe it until now." Xyrath stood there for a moment, looking at the young human sitting against the wall of a broken relay station, in the middle of the worst fighting in a decade. She thought about everything she knew about pain and soldiers, and what it meant to keep moving when the body was telling you to stop. She thought about the Caliph way. Feel the pain, assess the damage, make the rational decision. She thought about 40 minutes of fighting on broken ribs without saying a word. She did not have a name for what that was. She was not sure a name existed. Thessie got Callum to the medical bay. He complained mildly about it, which Thessie reported to the crew later, with an expression that suggested she still was not sure how to categorize the complaint. He was on his back in the medical bay, on the 3rd day, when Vec brought him the battle map. Nobody had asked Vec to do it. Vec had simply picked up the datapad, walked to the medical bay, and dropped it onto the cot beside Callum without much ceremony. "The tactical AI has no solution for their advance pattern," Vec said. "You should look at it." Callum looked at it. He lay there with 2 wrapped ribs and a sealed laceration on his side, holding a datapad above his face, studying a map of shroud movement across the Yessen corridor. He did not speak for 3 full minutes. The AI had been running calculations on this same data for 16 hours, and had produced 7 different models, none of which gave good odds. Then Callum lowered the pad and stared at the ceiling. "They're not advancing," he said. Vec, who was sitting in the corner, looked up. "They are clearly advancing. We have lost ground on 4 positions. They're pushing us toward the center relay. They want us bunched up." Callum tapped the pad. "My grandfather used to talk about how wolves hunt. They don't chase, they guide. They move their target the direction they want it to go, and then they close in." He held the pad out to Vec. "The shroud isn't attacking at random. It's herding. If we pull back to the center relay like the AI is suggesting, we're going exactly where it wants us." Vec took the pad. He was quiet for a long time. He took it to Xyrath. Xyrath looked at the map for 2 minutes, then changed the unit's positioning. She moved them counter to the AI's recommendation, spreading outward instead of pulling inward, holding 3 separate points instead of 1 central one. The shroud's next push hit the center relay hard. There was nothing there to hit. The Confederate units at the 3 outer points held their ground, and the shroud's advance stalled. 70 soldiers, who would have been caught at the center relay, were still alive by the end of the day. None of them made a speech about it. There was no time for speeches. But the crew knew, and the knowing settled over the ship like something warm and quiet. On the 4th night, when the corridor had gone still enough to breathe, Xyraeth's unit gathered in the main hold of the Iron Veil. This was not a planned thing. It happened the way important things often happened among soldiers, without announcement, without ceremony being called, but with everyone somehow knowing to come. Callum stood in the middle of them, uncertain about what was happening, still moving carefully around his healing ribs. Vec spoke first, in Caliph, then the others, one by one. Even Verath, who had once whispered about luck on a burning moon, spoke clearly and without hesitation. When it was done, Ziraeth told Callum what had just happened. She told him that in Caliph tradition, a unit name was not a rank, and it was not an assignment. It was given only to someone who had bled beside you and chosen to stay. It could not be ordered. It could not be transferred. It belonged to the person who had earned it, and to nobody else. She told him the name they had chosen. She told him what it meant. His jaw tightened slightly. He looked around at the faces in the room, silver-scaled, quiet, watching him with the steady, serious eyes of people who did not say things they did not mean. He nodded, once, slowly. In Caliph, that meant, I receive this, I will carry it. He did not know he had just done that, but Ziraeth did, and so did every soldier in the room. The name they had given him translated in Confederate Common to 4 words: the one who stays. The flagship arrived without warning. That was the first sign that this was not a friendly visit. Ships that came in friendship sent a signal ahead. They announced themselves. They gave time for the receiving crew to prepare, to set the docking lights, to be ready. Admiral Vessen's ship did none of those things. It simply appeared on the Iron Veil scanner, large and gray, and moving with the slow, heavy confidence of something that did not feel the need to ask permission. Ziraeth was on the bridge when it appeared. She looked at the scanner for a long moment. Then she looked at the ship identification code in the corner of the screen. She knew that code. Everyone in the Confederate military knew that code. She said nothing. She simply walked to the docking bay and waited. Admiral Vessen was Brellian. His species was tall and thin, with pale gray skin and large, flat eyes that never seemed to fully blink. The Brellian were known across the Confederacy for 2 things. The first was their extraordinary ability to navigate political systems. The kind of ability that let a person smile at you while doing something you would not like. The second was their patience. They could wait longer than almost any other species for the outcome they wanted. They simply outlasted things. Vessen walked off his ship with 4 armed escorts and a datapad under his arm, and the expression of someone arriving to collect something that had always belonged to them. He looked at Ziraeth. He nodded once, politely. "Commander," he said, "I will not take much of your time." "You never do, Admiral," she said. He held up the datapad and read from it, in the flat, unhurried way of someone reading from a document they had already memorized. Private Callum Dre, human, unassigned, was being held aboard the Iron Veil in violation of Confederate integration protocols. His transfer order, issued 2 weeks ago, had not been filed or acknowledged. He was to be remanded immediately to Confederate Research Division, where human combat physiology and battlefield behavior could be properly studied and documented for the benefit of the wider alliance. He lowered the pad. He looked at Ziraeth. He waited. Ziraeth did not answer immediately. She turned her head slightly and looked at Vec, who was standing near the inner door of the docking bay. Vec left without being told to. He came back 2 minutes later with Callum beside him. Callum walked into the docking bay and read the room in about 3 seconds. He looked at the 4 armed escorts. He looked at the Admiral. He looked at the datapad. Then he looked at Ziraeth, and he waited, the same way he had waited on the burning moon, still, patient, watching. Vessen looked at him with those large, flat eyes. He spoke to Callum directly, in Confederate Common. He said that the transfer was for Callum's benefit as much as the Confederacy's. That research division would give him proper care, proper housing, proper study. He used the word specimen once. Just once. It came out casually, the way a word slips out when a person has been thinking it for a long time, and forgets for just a moment to keep it inside. The docking bay went very quiet after that word. Callum did not move. His face did not change into anger. It changed into something cooler and harder than anger, the way metal cools after it has been heated. Still shaped by the fire, but no longer soft. He looked at Xyratheth. She stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. Xyratheth had never needed to raise her voice to make a room pay attention to her, and she did not need to now. She spoke to the Admiral in Confederate Common, clearly and without hurry, because she wanted every person in the docking bay to understand every word. She told him to look at the after-action report from the moon. She had a copy on her own datapad. She handed it to one of his escorts, without looking away from Vessen. She told him to look at the casualty projections her tactical AI had calculated, not guessed, calculated, for what the ridge engagement would have looked like without a single human soldier walking toward it first. She told him to look at the report from the relay station in the Yessen corridor. She told him what Thessie's medical scanner had found after 40 minutes of combat on broken ribs. She told him about 70 soldiers who were alive, because a young human lying in a medical bay had looked at a map for 3 minutes and remembered a story his grandfather once told him about wolves. She told him to read Vek's sworn field testimony. She said this while looking at Vessen steadily, because Vessen knew Vek's service record, and knew what it meant for a soldier like Vek to put his name on a testimony like that. Vessen listened to all of it. His expression did not change, but his large flat eyes moved, just slightly, just enough, in the way that meant he was recalculating. Then he opened his mouth to cite the protocol again. Xyraeth took one step forward. It was a small step, but it was the kind of step that changed the temperature of a room. She stood directly in front of Callum. She was taller than him by a full head, and she stood straight, and she faced the Admiral with the kind of stillness that Kalith warriors practiced for years, because it was more powerful than any amount of movement. She placed her right hand on Callum's shoulder. Her silver-scaled fingers were steady. She spoke in Old Kalith. It was the formal register, the one used for binding declarations and unit oaths. It was not a language that had much place in Confederate meetings or political discussions. It was a language for things that were meant to last. She said that this soldier had bled inside her unit. She said he had been named by her crew. She said he walked under her command and under her protection. Then she paused. The docking bay was absolutely silent. Vessen's 4 escorts had gone very still. Even the low hum of the ship's systems seemed quieter than it had been a moment ago. Xyraeth looked directly at Admiral Vessen. She dropped Old Kalith and spoke in plain Confederate Common, slowly and clearly, so that there was no possibility of confusion, no room for misunderstanding, no space for protocol or paperwork or careful political language to get between the words and their meaning. She gestured at Callum, a short, firm motion, the kind that pointed not just at a person, but at everything that person was, and everything they had done. "He belongs to me," she said. Nobody moved. Vessen looked at her. He was Brellian, and the Brellian understood patience better than almost anyone. But they also understood, better than almost anyone, when something was finished. He had come here with a datapad, and a protocol, and 4 armed escorts. He was standing in front of a Kalith commander, who had just made a unit bond declaration, in the formal language of her people, in front of witnesses, with her hand on the shoulder of the soldier he had come to take. There was no protocol for this. There was no form to fill in. There was nothing to do but understand that the wall he had walked into was not going to move. He closed his datapad. He looked at Callum one last time with those flat, unblinking eyes. Then he looked at Xyraeth. Then he turned and walked back up the ramp of his ship with his 4 escorts behind him, and the docking bay doors closed, and he was gone. The crew let out a collective breath that nobody had admitted to holding. Callum stood where he was for a moment. Then he looked at Vec, quietly. What did she say? The part in the other language. There was something in the old soldier's expression that had not been there on the day he had suggested a sparring match to prove a point. He translated the words carefully, without adding anything and without leaving anything out. Callum was quiet for a long time after that. The docking bay slowly emptied as the crew went back to their stations. Eventually it was just the two of them, Ziraeth and Callum, standing in the large, quiet space, with the stars visible through the outer screen. He asked her why. She looked at him for a moment. All the formal language was gone. All the ceremony was gone. She answered him the way one soldier answers another when the fight is over and the truth is the only thing left. Because you walked toward the ridge, she said. He nodded. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. 6 months later, the war was still happening, but it was happening differently. That was the only way to describe it. The shroud had not stopped. It had not pulled back. It was still out there, still moving, still sending its pale drones into Confederate space like water finding cracks in a wall. But something had shifted, not in the shroud, in the people fighting it. Stories had a way of traveling in wartime, faster than ships sometimes, faster than orders. A story did not need a signal channel or a command relay. It needed only one person to tell another person, and then that person to tell someone else, and so on across 100 ships and 100 species, until the story became something that everyone had heard, and nobody could remember first hearing. The story of the burning moon had traveled that way. The story of a young human crouching over 3 dead shroud drones, with steady hands, watching a ridge, waiting for more. The story of a commander who had stood in a docking bay, with her hand on that human's shoulder, and said words that closed a door on an admiral, and his datapad, and his 4 armed escorts. The story had spread the way true stories always spread. Not because someone ordered it to, but because people recognized something in it. Something they wanted to hold on to. Callum did not know about the story. He was too busy fighting the war. 6 months after the docking bay, Ziraeth's ship received reinforcements. A full company of human soldiers, reassigned from the Outer Rim as the Confederate military quietly, without making any formal announcement about it, began folding human units more deeply into the Alliance's combat structure. They arrived on 2 transport ships, 43 men and women, all young, all carrying the particular expression of soldiers who had been told they were going somewhere serious, and had decided to take that seriously. They came down the ramp in good order, and stood in the landing bay with their gear, and looked around at the Caliph crew with the careful attention of people entering a new place and trying to read it quickly. Ziraeth's crew looked back at them. 6 months ago, that mutual looking would have been full of distance. The Caliph would have seen small, soft-skinned creatures from a species that had only recently joined the Alliance. The humans would have seen tall, silver-scaled aliens who did not fully believe in them yet. There would have been politeness, the careful, managed kind that people use when they do not know each other and are not sure they want to. But 6 months had passed. And there was Callum, walking across the landing bay to meet the new arrivals, with the easy movement of someone who knew every corner of the ship. And there was Vec, standing near the door, watching the humans come in with the same steady eyes he used for everything. Not hostile, not performing warmth, just present, just seeing them. One of the new soldiers, a young woman named Sarah, looked at Callum, and then looked at the Caliph unit around him, and then looked at Callum again with a question in her eyes that she did not have to say out loud. Callum understood the question. He had asked it himself, once, in a different way, on a very different day. "You'll be all right," he said simply. "Just show up." It was not a speech. It was not a strategy or a lesson or a piece of wisdom wrapped carefully in good words. It was the plainest possible version of the truth, and Sarah nodded the way people nod when they hear something plain and true and useful. The integration was not perfect. Nothing real ever was. There were moments of friction. Small misunderstandings between species that had different habits, and different ways of reading a room, and different ideas about how much personal space meant, and how loud a conversation was allowed to get before it became an argument. There were days when the differences felt larger than the common ground. But the common ground was there. It had always been there. It just needed time and shared weight before it became visible. They fought together in 4 engagements over the following 3 weeks. And by the 4th engagement, nobody on the ship was counting species anymore when they looked left and right to check who was beside them. They were counting soldiers. Then came the Battle of Vessen Prime. Vessen Prime was a Confederate core world. It had a population of 11 million. It had been inside Confederate space long enough that nobody had seriously considered the possibility of it being threatened. And then, the shroud came in from 3 directions at once, and everybody had to very quickly adjust their understanding of what was and was not possible. Every ship in the sector was pulled toward Vessen Prime, Zyraeth's ship among them. They came out of faster-than-light travel into a battle that was already loud and already costly and already asking more from everyone than anyone had planned for. Callum stood at the tactical table beside Zyraeth as the data came in. He had been doing this for months now, standing where the information was, watching the patterns, letting his mind do the thing it did, the thing that did not have a scientific name, but worked anyway. He watched the shroud's movement across Vessen Prime's orbital zone, and he felt the same thing he had felt, looking at the map in the Yessen corridor. The direction it was pushing toward. He found the coordination node in 11 minutes. It was buried inside the shroud's central formation, protected by its heaviest units, positioned in a way that a purely tactical mind, looking for military logic, might not immediately identify. But Callum was not looking for military logic. He was looking for the center of the web, the place that everything else was connected to. He found it the same way his grandfather had once taught him to find the main root of a tangled plant, not by pulling at the visible parts, but by following the direction everything was leaning. He pointed at it on the map. He explained it in 3 sentences. Zyraeth looked at the point he was indicating. She looked at him. She did not ask him if he was sure. She had stopped asking that months ago. She gave the order. The assault on the node was the hardest fighting the Iron Veil's crew had seen in the entire war. It cost them people they knew and had eaten beside, and had watched sleep for 9 hours, and had called by their names. There was no way around that cost, and no way to make it lighter than it was. But the node fell. When it fell, the shroud's coordination across the entire Vessen Prime engagement collapsed. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough for the Confederate forces to push forward. Enough for 11 million people on a planet below to still be there the next morning. In the quiet after the battle, when the guns had stopped, and the ships were holding position, and everyone was doing the slow, heavy work of counting who remained, a young Caliph soldier found Zyraeth standing at the edge of the ship's observation deck. He was new to the unit, young enough that the moon and the corridor and the docking bay were stories he had heard, rather than things he had lived through. He asked her if the stories about the human were true, all of them. Zyraeth looked out through the observation window. Below them, Vessen Prime turned slowly in the dark, its lights still on, its cities still whole. Across the deck, Callum was helping 2 crew members carry a wounded Caliph soldier toward the medical bay. He was talking to the injured soldier as they walked, not about the wound, about something else, something quiet. Keeping the soldier's mind on a voice rather than on the pain. Zyraeth watched him for a long moment. Then she said, The stories are smaller than the truth. The young soldier looked at her, then looked at Callum, then looked back at her, with the expression of someone filing something away permanently. Later, much later, when the night cycle had settled over the ship and most of the crew had found their rest, Callum told Zyreth about the promotion, a command role in a new multi-species tactical division that Confederate Command was quietly putting together. A role that would take him off the Iron Veil. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without dressing it up, giving her the information and waiting. She told him, without any hesitation at all, that he should take it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her if the bond dissolved when he left. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that on a Caliph face worked the way a smile worked on a human one. Old and warm and certain. The bond does not dissolve, she said. You carry it wherever you go. That is the point. He nodded. He understood. Somewhere in the Confederate archives, between field reports and casualty logs and a transfer order that was never filed and never would be, there was a single line added to Zyreth's official record in her own handwriting. It had no tactical significance. It would not change any outcome or affect any report. It simply said, Unit Bond declared. Callum Dre, human, private. Reason? He stayed.